We are going to step away from the Roy Oliver case in Texas, folks, to announce the verdict in the Paul Manafort case. This is a federal case in Virginia. This is the Eastern District of Virginia. The verdict coming in from the jury, a mistrial on 10 of 18 counts. But here's the news, guilty on 8 counts. Those counts involving tax fraud, bank records, and failure to file. Law&Crime's Colin Kalmbacher is here in the studio with me. Colin was here, or I should say was present, for very large chunks of the Paul Manafort case. Again, Paul Manafort, President Trump's campaign chair for a couple of months.
Absolutely.
Guilty on 8 of 10 counts. You were there. Give us the color commentary. Is this a surprise?
It's a surprise in some senses, and it's not a surprise at all in another sense. This was essentially a case, a story about American wealth, how at least one man and the people in his orbit accumulated wealth, kept it from the authorities, and built on that wealth. And then whenever they kind of ran dry, when the hole ran a little bit dry, how they tried to get, more money to kind of staunch the bleeding. So this mistrial, that might be a bit of a surprise, though I would say the evidence that accumulated at trial, there was a lot of it, and a lot of it was confusing. So not particularly surprising that maybe the jurors couldn't nail it down, but those 8 guilty charges, that is quite a bit of time in a federal prison for Mr. Manafort.
Okay, so look, it's a sympathetic argument for a prosecutor to get up in front of a jury and say, you all pay your taxes, and this guy didn't.
Sure.
So those seem like relatively easy counts to get, at least sort of from a theoretical standpoint. But what about the other 10 here? What didn't they get?
So they didn't get a few of the bank fraud charges, and they didn't get a few of the failure to file a foreign bank account report with FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Those were, I suppose, some of the more complex charges. They had to deal with lots of, I guess, he said, she said. The bank fraud charges in particular heavily relied on the testimony of Rick Gates, who I suppose at least some of the jurors decided was not the credible witness. And I guess this does speak a bit to defense attorney Kevin Downing, who absolutely tore into him every chance and opportunity he got, including in closing arguments when he just kind of assailed the government for relying on him. And that must have struck a chord with at least a few of those jurors, maybe just one.
Yeah, I mean, look, certainly this is a case we wish we all could have watched, but no cameras in federal court. So it seems like where the jurors might have gotten stuck then is the co-conspirator, coming and copping a deal and testifying against Manafort. They just didn't want to give a lot of credit to his testimony, saying maybe you're cooking this up to try to save your own hide, and we want to discount what you said. Does that sound like what you saw?
That sounds a little plausible. Just to double back, also a few of those failure to file a foreign bank account report with FinCEN charges, those heavily relied on the testimony of Rick Gates as well. And they included some very, I would say, Byzantine, obscure, even for financial crimes attorneys, hard to understand federal regulations that I guess the government just wasn't able to get across to the jury, or maybe the jury just didn't believe them.
And that's certainly a possibility. Is it accurate to say that they got him on the top counts, or did they not get him on the top counts?
The top counts. What do you mean by the top counts?
The big fish, the ones with the worst punishment.
So the bank fraud were the ones that had up to 30 years in prison. That's why we got this top line number of accumulating all the charges. Paul Manafort faces up to 305 years in prison. So most of the bank fraud charges, a hung jury or a mistrial, whatever you want to term it. That means that, the tax charges, I think, are 3 to 5 years in prison, are the sentencing guideline maximums there. So maybe, I think he kind of ducked, at least for now, some of the big fish.
Some of the more serious ones, but they did get a guilty on 2 of the bank fraud charges, though, you said, correct? So are they lesser versions of it, or are we waiting to see?
It's hard to say right now. I think
we don't have all.
We don't have all of the details, but 30 years is still 30 years, and the way that these things are typically sentenced, they would not be concurrently adjudicated or handed out to the defendant. They would be consecutive. So you're looking at least, just going to do some very back of my brain napkin math here, about 75 years in prison, just based on the charges that we're familiar with right now alone. that does mean if he is sentenced to the full extent of the law that Paul Manafort will almost certainly die in a federal prison cell unless he decides to play ball in the future.
Yeah, okay, so what's next for these 10 counts upon which there was no verdict? I mean, usually we see at least an attempt to try someone again on those counts.
Yeah, I don't think the government's going to let this one go. Greg Andres, Uzo Osonye, Mr. Van Gleek, all the other U.S. attorneys, assistant U.S. attorneys, they put together quite a case. I saw the literal dozens and dozens of boxes of evidence being carted in, day out, with the scrawled handwriting, Manafort, Gates, Ukraine, 12 of 15, 8 of 18, things of that nature. They have the evidence, they have the files, it's all there on paper. This was something I was trying to get across in most of my reporting, that this case really was a paper trail case more than the witnesses themselves. They were kind of there to clear that up for the jury more than anything else. So I would assume that the government is going to take another bite.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we'll be watching it. You will be watching it. Let me back up. You were there for this, okay? So
yeah,
you had the privileged perch upon which so many people who have been watching this case wish they could have
You could
had.
call it privilege, sure.
What is it? I am saying it because you, sir, are a gifted man. So, look, a walking thesaurus, I say, of your reports on lawandcrime.com. But look, you were there. What's the mood in the room? I mean, was this a case where both sides, you could tell, hated one another's guts? Were they cordial? What was it like being there for it?
It was nothing like there was no amount of hatred expressed in the courtroom. If anything, I saw the prosecution and the defense being perhaps a little bit too chummy for the defendant's liking. At one point, I caught the second chair in the case, Uzo Osonye, joking around with, I can't remember if this was Richard Westling or Kevin Downing. They joked around with each other, and Paul Manafort shot his own attorneys kind of a side eye there, the dead gaze, and he wasn't too happy to see his attorneys joking around. But you know, this is kind of the way things typically tend to go. Attorneys don't really hate each other; they're doing their jobs. So
yeah, I mean, the buzzword in the profession is professionalism, which is a lawyer's way of saying argue your points of law, but don't hate one another in the process. And perhaps you were seeing that.
Yeah, and Jimmy McNulty has a very famous line about this in The Wire that I don't think we're allowed to repeat on TV. That's not HBO.
Then we won't.
Yes, and we won't, but you know, anybody can look it up if they're so interested. The mood in the courtroom was mostly people responding in one way or another to how dry the case was, and then occasionally when Judge Ellis would offer the color commentary, typically by dressing down and upbraiding the prosecution for their slights, real or imagined. But it was mostly an affair where even the journalists that were next to me most of the time were complaining about their own eyes glazing over, about their hands hurting from jotting down so much, and not really necessarily knowing what to make of it as it all came out. It was a lot to, I guess, take in and then metabolize and then turn into a compelling narrative. But I think on the basic questions, the government was able to prove their case that this was a wealthy man who used the system to his advantage. He used some high-priced, white-glove accounting firms, including forensic accounting firms. He either lied to them or had them in league with his lies, and it looks like he is going to be suffering the consequences. Consequences that I'd imagine most jurors don't ever expect to face, and that's probably because they are not campaign advisors to the President of the United States of America.
Yeah, I mean, a lot to talk about the Paul Manafort case, but meanwhile, we're also talking about the Michael Cohen case. This is the case of President Trump's personal lawyer. He, in federal court just moments ago, entered guilty pleas for a number of charges, including tax evasion, making a false statement with relation to a credit decision, and making an excessive campaign contribution. Now, the top charge there is the false statement one. I'm hearing that could be a maximum of 30 years in prison if he is so sentenced. So, Colin, we're watching these come down at basically
absolutely.
the same exact time here.
Right. There is an embarrassment of riches right now. We're going to have stories to write on for at least 2 more years, but we'll try to get them all down in the next couple of weeks, I suppose. And I say collectively, the media. This one I'm not shocked or surprised by at all. I was there for some of the initial Michael Cohen hearings on those FBI SDNY raids. And from the get-go, Michael Cohen, the defendant, he looked completely dejected. his attorneys were not winning a single argument, and you of course had the sideshow of the Stormy Daniels issue sort of taking up a lot of the oxygen there. But just going on the merits of the Cohen case, very few of which were public, but probably were all known to Cohen himself. It never looked good for him.
Yeah, okay, so some more updates from this. We have guilty pleas from Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen says he violated campaign law at the direction of a candidate, but doesn't directly name the candidate who directed the campaign violation. This is coming out of the hearing. Okay, at least that's one chunk of it, and I'm getting this in spurts.
Yeah,
because,
yeah,
again,
I would assume
federal court, no cameras. So okay, is he working for another candidate other than Donald Trump? What's going on with this?
This is typical. It's kind of like reading this wasn't actually an indictment. This was an information. But they're typically written the same way. Instead of going out and saying exactly who they're referring to, they'll use things like person A, gentleman A, candidate A,
organization Z.
Organization, yeah, whatever it is. So this is not to be unexpected, and at least for a couple of reasons, but it's fairly obvious who we're talking about here.
Yeah, okay, so another update coming from within this Michael Cohen courtroom across town here in Manhattan. Cohen admits to working at the direction of the candidate and the National Enquirer to silence Karen McDougal, okay, one of the alleged mistresses here. Also admits to Stormy Daniels' payment that he made, quote, with and at direction of the same candidate. So now we've got Stormy Daniels, now we've got Karen McDougal. We've got them tied in with Michael Cohen admissions of guilt here. Again, false statements involving credit decisions, tax evasion, and excessive campaign contributions. That excessive campaign contributions is I think going to be one of the big ones here. Yeah,
those I believe carry a maximum of it's in the double digits. If you knowingly contribute over $25,000 aggregated in any campaign election calendar year, then and knowingly and willfully, Michael Cohen, as an attorney, as someone who has been around the block, been to more than a couple rodeos before, I'm pretty sure the government wouldn't have too hard of a time proving that he knew the law and intentionally conspired to break it here. So once again, no shocker, no surprise. It is interesting that it's all coming up on the same day.
It's coming up now. Look, we got to take a quick break here on the Law and Crime Network. Again, guilty verdicts against Paul Manafort, Michael Cohen admitting guilt. We will be right back with more.